Seeing none, without objection.
President,
Senator from Arkansas.
I call up my amendment number 3680 and ask that it be reported by number.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Arkansas, Mr. Cotton, proposes an amendment number 3680.
Mr. President,
Senator from Arkansas.
growing up, I was taught, as I suspect most of you were, that America is a great and noble nation, in large part because, as Lincoln put it, it's dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. In America, our rights have no color. Our law and society should be colorblind, and as Dr. Martin Luther King said, we should not be judged by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character. Sadly, today, some want to replace our founding principles with an un-American ideology called critical race theory. They want to teach our children that America is not a good nation, but a racist nation. Those teachings are wrong, and our tax dollars should not support them. My amendment will ensure that federal funds aren't used to indoctrinate kids as young as pre-K to hate America. Our future depends on the next generation of kids loving America and loving each other as fellow citizens, no matter their race. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the amendment.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, the Senate's not in order.
Senate will be in order.
Mr. President, thank you. You know, this amendment is simply an attempt to force the federal government to interfere with local school districts' decisions about curriculum and academic instruction. There are several long-standing provisions in federal education law that prohibit the federal government from mandating or directing school curriculum. This amendment would contradict that bipartisan consensus and allow the federal government to have a say over what schools can and cannot teach our children. I oppose this amendment because I believe states, local school districts, and educators should be in the driver's seat when making decisions about curriculum, and I urge my colleagues to vote no.
Mr. President,
Senator from Arkansas.
let's vote. I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Scared me.
Wicker is aye.
Thank you. Mr. Barrasso. I got you. Mr. Bennett. Thank you. Ms. Smith, you. Booker. I got you. Leahy.
Podium, Blackburn.
Would you like to vote on your own amendment? Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman. Thank you. Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons. Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Braun, Burr, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Crapo, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Inhofe, Johnson, Kennedy, Lee, Lummis, Manchin, Marshall, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Portman, Risch, Romney, Rubio, Sass, Scott of Florida, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Tuberville, Wicker, and Young. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Lankford, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Lujan, Menendez, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Shaheen, Sinema, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Hoeven, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Oh, Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. This is Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Coons, no. Here they come. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye.
The yeas are 50, the nays are 49, and the amendment is agreed to.
Mr. President,
Senator from Vermont.
I ask unanimous consent